Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Wednesday, January 3rd, 2018. Interesting new spin surfaces about Russiagate as the indicted Paul Manafort challenges Robert Mueller's scope of authority to indict him. Lots to talk about today in the news and plenty of commentary from your humble host. I want to let you know that we had been last year doing live video feeds on Friday afternoons on Facebook. Not going to continue that this year. I'm going to use Facebook in a different way. And I want to thank all the people who watched and many people who called in during those live broadcasts. And we will continue to find ways to include our listeners and interactivity in the podcast stream that you get at peterbcollins.com. So at my deadline here, which is just after 2 o'clock Pacific time today, the Washington Post is flashing a bulletin that Paul Manafort has challenged his indictment by special counsel Robert Mueller in a federal lawsuit. Now, this is a one-sentence report, so I can't expand too much upon it. But the challenge is that Mueller and the Justice Department's prosecution of him concerns business dealings that have nothing to do with their investigation of Russian interference in last year's presidential campaign. Now, with this narrow statement, I have to say that Manafort has a point because he's been indicted for, money laundering and failing to report his international business activities, and I think those are legitimate transgressions. But they don't have anything to do with Russian hacking of the DNC, the alleged meddling interference in our election last year. And I think it'll be fascinating to see how this plays out. Because my understanding is that the special counsel actually has no restraints on the scope of what he can look for and what he can issue indictments on. But this could go all the way to the Supreme Court, and it could be truly fascinating. So you may know that every night on my DVR, I save Rachel Maddow's program, and I watch it with great interest. We have a little pool at our house about how long it will take during the first few minutes of her show for the Russia shit to fly. And last night, she had an interesting developing story because the New York Times had just moments before she went on the air posted an op-ed from Glenn Simpson and Peter Fritsch. These are two former journalists, I would call them wayward journalists, who once worked for the Wall Street Journal. They are the co-founders of Fusion GPS. And Fusion GPS is a paid operative of information warfare. That's what they do. These are journalists, investigators for hire, and their flexible ethics and orientation were demonstrated by their own admissions that in 2016 they first were digging for dirt on Trump for a Republican paymaster. And when Trump clinched the nomination, they switched over to Hillary Clinton's campaign, laundered through a law firm, as the paymaster for their Trump investigations. Now, they do offer new information, which is interesting, fascinating, tantalizing to people who buy into the Trump-Russia telenovela narrative. I'm going to take you through it here in some detail, because what I notice most are the omissions from the spun-up narrative that they offer. Now, first and foremost, the point of their op-ed is to pressure the three congressional committees, House and Senate Intelligence and the Senate Judiciary, who have interviewed them, to honor the agreement to release the transcripts of those what were off the record, or at least non-public interrogations. And I fully support Simpson and Fritsch on that issue. We all deserve to see this, and the fact that they accuse Republicans of playing games with this, that's a worthy criticism that, I'll take into account. But in this article, they tell their side of the story very effectively. Again, what I note is what they don't talk about. And let's start out by echoing Joe Laria's column that was spiked by the Huffington Post, noting that Fusion GPS and CrowdStrike are the two pillars of the Trump-Russia narrative. And both of these firms were paid by the Clinton campaign. So they're not just unbiased, independent, objective investigators. They were paid to get information that would be useful to the people who were paying them. So Fritsch and Simpson accuse the media and even the Wall Street Journal, their former employer, of spinning a succession of mendacious conspiracy theories about our motives and our backers. And so then they tell us that they're going to tell us everything we need to know. So they talk about 3 congressional committees have heard 21 hours of testimony, and it should be published. I don't have any contention with that. Then they say that in those hearings, they walked investigators through the year-long effort to decipher Trump's complex business past, of which the Steele dossier is but one chapter. Well, guys, can we see the rest of the book? And we handed over our relevant bank records while drawing the line at a fishing expedition for other people that we worked for. And keep in mind that they did work for the American billionaire who is at the center of the whole Magnitsky Law, the Magnitsky scandal. And his name is Bill B. something. I'm sorry, I can't summon it right now. But I think that's what they're indirectly referring to there. And it's raised questions about how they probably should have known about the Trump Tower meeting in June of 2016. They deny any knowledge at the time. They say they found out like the rest of us. And they argue we don't believe the Steele dossier was the trigger for the FBI's investigation into Russian meddling. They also concede that Christopher Steele at one point decided he was witnessing crimes in progress and he contacted the FBI. They don't put a date on when Steele made that contact. And we know that Steele had connections to the FBI and CIA from past work. So the omission of that date is a stunning matter, because we're now being told, as I led yesterday's podcast, that Papadopoulos, who had a multiple bottle of wine meeting with an Australian diplomat in London and spilled beans that Russia had dirt on Hillary, and the Australians reported that to the CIA 2 months later, in the middle of July. And another critical time point is, when did the FISA court first hear requests for warrants to surveil members of the Trump campaign? When did they reject the first request? We have that data. We just don't know when these actions occurred. And so by omitting any kind of a timeline, it allows the Fusion GPS guys, as we've seen Rachel Maddow and the Democrats, to fudge the timelines of these events. And it really is critical to consistently ask the question, what did somebody know and when did they know it? And as I articulated yesterday, this new late-breaking, information that Papadopoulos was outed by Australian intelligence could easily be parallel construction, that they've created this little line to avoid seeing the Steele dossier as the trigger for the FBI investigation based on a FISA warrant. And these are questions that Rachel Maddow didn't get to in her coverage last night. And we need to understand more about it. The op-ed here goes on from the Fusion GPS founders. Finally, we debunked the biggest canard being pushed by the president's men, the notion that we somehow knew of the June 9, 2016 meeting in Trump Tower between some Russians and the Trump Brain Trust. We first learned of that from news reports last year, and the committees know it. And they also know that these Russians were unaware of Chris Steele's work for us and were not sources for his reports. Now, that's a very interesting denial. Yes, they say we hired Steele, but we did so without informing him whom we were working for and gave him no specific marching orders beyond the basic question, why did Trump repeatedly seek to do deals in a notoriously corrupt police state that most serious investors shun? Steele's sources in Russia came back to us with shocking information. They note that Steele's sources were not paid. We still don't know who any of them are and how credible their information might be. Anyway, Steele's sources reported on an extensive, now confirmed effort by the Kremlin to help elect Trump president. Confirmed by whom? With what evidence? With what identified sources, gentlemen? Steele saw this as a crime in progress and decided he needed to report it to the FBI. But the crucial fact is, when did he do that? They note that Steele did share his intelligence with John McCain, but it was after the election. I was under the impression it was actually before. Can't prove it either way right now. So this is a very interesting exercise. But as I've pointed out, the omissions in the Fritsch and, what's the other guy's name? Simpson op-ed here are glaring. And let's keep in mind that by attacking the Republicans, whether it's worthy or not, they are continuing to advance the interests of their former client, the Clinton for President campaign. Now, the other big news today is that a new book has been published by Michael Wolff called Fire and Fury Inside the White House, and it is causing a firestorm, another Twitter storm from Trump, because Steve Bannon gave a lot of loose-lipped quotes to Michael Wolff. Now, let's begin with Trump channeling St. Peter right there at the gates of Gethsemane with these over-the-top denials of the man who he once called the savior of his campaign. And forgive the Christ metaphor, if you will, there. But Trump is now saying, come on. Steve Bannon? I only met with him one-on-one occasionally. He's exaggerated everything. He was using his position in the White House to leak like a sieve. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the reliable denier. This book is filled with false, misleading accounts from individuals who have no access or influence with the White House. Well, maybe now. Participating in a book that can only be described as trashy tabloid fiction exposes their sad, desperate attempts at relevancy. And then a statement issued in the voice of Trump himself. It's quite lengthy. Steve Bannon has nothing to do with me or my presidency. When he was fired, he not only lost his job, he lost his mind. Steve was a staffer who worked for me after I had already won the nomination. Often described as the most talented field, against 17 candidates. That's such a joke. He cracks me up, can't you tell? Steve is now learning that winning isn't as easy as I make it look. Steve had very little to do with our historic victory. Well, let's just mention the Mercer family that pumped billions in dark money into PACs supporting Trump. The Mercer family that bought Cambridge Analytica, which provided the dark targeting of Facebook and other advertising messages that were effectively used by the Trump campaign to rally the racists and all the other fine people who helped rack up his vote count. And one more mention, when Bannon left the White House, Trump offered him only praise. So this is quite a turnaround for Trump. In a random manner, here are some of the juicy quotes from the book. Ann Coulter took Trump aside and said, apparently nobody's telling you this, but you can't just hire your children. Well, Ann, he sure listened to you on that. He, basically snipes at everybody who works for him. After dinner, he'd get on the phone, speculate on the flaws and weaknesses. Bannon was disloyal, always looks like shit. Priebus is weak, not to mention he was short, a midget. Kushner was a suck-up. Sean Spicer was stupid and looks bad. Conway was a crybaby. Jared and Ivanka should never have come to Washington. So this guy is so insecure and so self-absorbed that he revels in bringing down other people. A quote from a conversation between Steve Bannon and the late and disgraced Fox News founder Roger Ailes. Ailes asked, "What has Trump gotten himself into with the Russians?" Bannon responds, "Mostly, he went to Russia and he thought he was going to meet Putin, but Putin couldn't give a shit about him, so he's kept trying." All right. Thomas Barrack, a billionaire, former chair of the inaugural committee, is quoted by, we don't know whom, saying that Trump is not only crazy, he's stupid. Nice to know the people who brought him to the party feel that way. And then we get to Bannon's quotes about that meeting at Trump Tower. The three senior guys in the campaign thought it was a good idea to meet with a foreign government inside Trump Tower in the conference room on the 25th floor with no lawyers. They didn't have any lawyers. Even if you thought that this was not treasonous or unpatriotic or bad shit, and I happen to think it's all of that, you should have called the FBI immediately. Bannon also says he thinks Trump himself met the Russians after the meeting, although he didn't arrive until August of 2016. He said the chance that Don Jr. did not walk these Jumos up to his father's office is zero. They're going to crack Don Jr. like an egg on national TV, Bannon said, referring to the Mueller investigation. So that's the juicy stuff. Then we get to the 17 tweets that Trump pumped out on the first business day of the new year, offending people all over the world and trying to make himself relevant in the dispute between North and South Korea, where he's been cut out by the little rocket man who he loves to make fun of. And Kim Jong-un, in his speech on New Year's Day, said that the nuclear button is on his desk at all times. Now, that's a threat from a bully. But Trump, a bully himself, and insecure, could not resist a response. And so what we end up with is dick-to-dick diplomacy, because my nuclear button is bigger and better and more operational than your nuclear button. And it really has devolved to that. And this is so cringeworthy. I mean, Larry David might do something like that. But somebody playing President of the United States should think better of it. And even the New York Times didn't miss the metaphor. The language was reminiscent of Trump's boast during the 2016 campaign that his hands, and by extension his genitals, were in fact big enough. So North Korea didn't apparently follow up on the dick-to-dick diplomacy or the comparison there, but they have responded to South Korea's receptivity by reopening a border hotline that has been cut off for the last 2 years. And you may find this bizarre in the digital age, but there is absolutely no communication link until the restoration of this hotline between North Korea and South Korea, and they've had to communicate in recent days by holding press conferences that are then broadcast either to the north or to the south. So this is a significant step, and we'll see where it leads. But it leaves Trump just frustrated on the sidelines, tweeting madly, saying, "Hey, I'm over here. Pay attention to me. I'm a bully too. Be afraid of me." So let me briefly jump through the various tweets that he issued. He offered support for the people in Iran who are protesting, and I've got an item on that we'll get to in a moment. He put out a tweet demanding the funding for a border wall and tweaking Democrats because he successfully created a hostage situation with the Dreamers. We talked about his Korean stuff. Oh, he took credit for the lack of any airline accidents during his first year in the White House, saying that it's because he had been very strict on commercial aviation. But, there haven't been any American-flagged airliner crashes for at least 8 years. Nobody bothered to give him that context. He attacked the New York Times. He attacked the media in general. Let's see. He said nice things about Orrin Hatch. And then he attacked Pakistan and the Palestinians. And we'll get to the Palestinian reaction in a moment. But he wants to withhold what is a couple of $100 million a year that is paid through the UN refugee program and that then trickles down to Palestinians. And he thinks that by cutting off this money for refugees, that he can force the Palestinians to the table. This is ugly, and it will backfire. It certainly has no potential to really advance the interests of either party. And the taking credit for no plane crashes produced a lot of snarky tweets like, since taking office, the sun has risen in the east and sets in the west. All credit to me. That's James Batts. Harrison Cole, since taking office, I've been very strict on polio vaccination. Good news. There were no polio cases in the United States last year. You get the idea. But more seriously, by threatening to cut off funding for the Palestinians and not any equivalent measure for the Israelis, whom Obama gave a big raise to last year without extracting any kind of concessions, is really unconscionable. And by treating refugees as hostages and claiming that this is going to bring the Palestinians to the peace table, it's really crazy. And we have reaction from Hanan Ashrawi, member of the Executive Committee of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Trump has sabotaged our search for peace, freedom, and justice. Now he dares to blame the Palestinians for the consequences of his own irresponsible actions. Meanwhile, Benjamin Netanyahu, the radical Zionist and extremist prime minister of Israel, is upping the ante and potentially expanding the allegations of apartheid that are launched at the government of Israel. And after using the Knesset to put restrictions on any moves related to Jerusalem becoming the capital of, say, the Palestinians, Netanyahu yesterday advanced a plan to forcibly deport as many as 40,000 Africans who settled in Israel over the last decade or so. Now, there's a plan to offer them cash. There's a plan to offer Rwanda cash for accepting some of these people. They're mostly Sudanese and Eritrean. The idea that they would want to go to Rwanda is pretty crazy. But many of them have settled in poor neighborhoods in Tel Aviv. And this has led to local residents saying, get those black people out of here. And Netanyahu doesn't appear to express any concern about shame, about being a racist, about advancing a racist policy. And this is one of the ugliest developments that I've seen. He tried to gild it this way on the Lily. He said, today the cabinet will approve the plan for deporting the infiltrators from Israel. We will step up enforcement and allocate budgets and personnel to implement the plan. I think that it's important that people understand that what we are doing, that we are doing something here that is completely legal and completely essential. I think George Wallace said that when he was trying to maintain segregation in the South in the 1960s. Another target of Trump's tweet storm yesterday was Iran and his continuing support for the protesters there only fuels the argument coming from Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, that the enemies of Iran are behind the current protests. Now, there's an interesting analysis in the New York Times today by Thomas Erdbrink, and he advances what is a plausible scenario here, at least one of the factors driving the protests. He says that it's largely driven by disaffected young people in rural areas and that it is driven by recent disclosure of what used to be the secret budget of the government. And they discovered by looking online that billions of dollars were going to hardline religious organizations, the military, religious foundations that enrich the clerical elite, and the budget proposed to end cash subsidies for millions of citizens, increase fuel prices, and privatize public schools. Now, many of the same efforts are underway here in the United States today. And it took the international analyst Trevor Noah, the South African-born host of The Daily Show, to point out last night that this is very similar to the Republican tax plan. Yet, despite the transparency of how the Republicans are soaking the middle class and the poor to give money to the rich, we don't have any protests on our streets. And, again, maybe that does offer some credibility to the claims of the Ayatollah. Well, let's credit the media editor at BuzzFeed, Craig Silverman. He did some deep research around the use of the phrase fake news. And he identified that Trump used it in public at a news conference on January 11th last year when he refused to call on a CNN reporter saying, "You are fake news." And that was not the first time that he used it. But Silverman also discovered that the term was used in an address that Hillary Clinton delivered on December 8th of 2016 at the retirement ceremony for the Democrats' Senate leader, Harry Reid. And here's the quote. Let me just mention briefly one thread in particular that should concern all Americans. The epidemic of malicious fake news and false propaganda that flooded social media over the past year. It's now clear that so-called fake news can have real-world consequences. So it's hard to imagine that Trump would want to steal a phrase, a line, from crooked Hillary, but it looks that's how it developed. Today, in a real advancement of diversity in the United States Senate, a white guy named Jones and a white woman named Smith were sworn in as two new Democratic senators. The Smith is Tina Smith, former, Attorney General Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota. She replaces Al Franken, who did make good on his promise to resign yesterday. And then there's Doug Jones, the Democrat of Alabama. So the interesting thing is here, the Democrats pick up a gain of net 1. The margin for the Republicans is reduced to 2, and that makes it tougher for the Republicans to ram through legislation like that ugly tax package. And finally today, I want to honor an unnamed 57-year-old Polish guy. He flew from Britain to Malaga, which is a nice town on the Mediterranean in the south of Spain. Now, the cheapo flight on Ryanair was delayed for an hour leaving London, and then when they got to Malaga, the airport required the plane to stay on the tarmac for at least another 30 minutes. And this guy got tired of waiting and tired of being, cattle in an airplane. And so he forced open the emergency exit over the wing of the airplane. And he crawled out there with his carry-on bag. But then he figured out that the wing was too high off the ground for him to jump. And he had to turn tail and head back into the airplane where he was arrested. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. It's free and you're free to share it. We post it on YouTube when all the clicks work out. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to